David Nage, Principal of Strategic Relations at Arca. It's great to see you. Talking all about Bitcoin.
That's right.
Which has gone from 3,000, 13,000 over the last year. I remember 20,000. I mean, it's had a wild run. What are some people saying about Bitcoin at this point?
What we're starting to see is that it's identifying as a global macro hedge. And what we're starting to see is at the beginning of 2020 that investors were accumulating at spot. And then around the 13th of the month, we started to see derivatives and we started to see options. Concurrently, the CME also started a trading and options platform at that point too.
Right.
But what we saw, and we can actually pinpoint it to the hours of the specific instances of that conflict, we saw that when the initial drone strike happened, that Bitcoin lagged a few hours in terms of running up, whereas gold and oil actually did quite well. What we saw, and we think it's really interesting, is that when Trump de-escalated, Bitcoin dropped concurrently right after that point in time. Investors said, okay, things are calming down. We don't necessarily need to go into that world. And so we started to see a real interesting phase where investors were thinking of it as a global macro hedge. And so what happened on the 13th is that we started to see derivatives and options. And I think my team believes, is that we're going into something called the halvening. That's happening in 118 days, where programmatically the rewards that Bitcoin miners are going to start receiving is going to be cut in half. Well, actually, it's going to be 6 1/4, where it was 12.5 Bitcoin.
Oh.
And so we're starting to see that there could be a supply, issue. If you believe in
that drive up the price, then
we believe that if you believe in global macro, if you believe in classical supply and demand, that if you have a supply cut and you have demand that is continuing or penting up, that prices could accrete. And so we believe that is possible. One of the things could happen. There isn't consensus among the community about that yet, but we do believe that with supply being cut and with demand potentially coming up. We saw very interesting research from State Street recently. They interviewed 101 institutional investors. 94% of them said that they currently have digital assets. Or
that's amazing.
I know.
Or what?
Or they want to in 2020.
Okay, so let's stop right there, because right now it's hovering just below the 9,000 mark. You're saying that because people don't really know what Bitcoin really is, right? Because it's just, we have some data and evidence to show that maybe it's a safe haven play, but it's not with certainty that it is that. Also, there are some calls out there for 16,000. What would your team say to 16,000 Bitcoin?
We make it a case that we do not actually speculate on the price. We believe, as you just alluded to, that the data and the KPIs and the historical precedence is really not there to actually start to speculate on the prediction and the price of Bitcoin. What we can see is that we're seeing demand starting to actually come to the market. We're seeing infrastructure in the market. We've seen Gemini, we've seen Anchorage, we've seen Fidelity, we've seen institutional development of platforms that support the acquisition and the accumulation of Bitcoin and other digital assets.
And as it becomes more and more common, right, because you said 94% of the folks in the survey either owned it or are interested in owning it. We heard the interesting story of the NBA player from the Nets who wants to tokenize his salary, and even says if he goes to the All-Star game, he's giving out Bitcoin. When we talk about Dinwiddie of the Nets and tokenizing the contract, I mean, that is such why not just get paid in dollars and then just put it to Bitcoin if you want?
So the interesting thing about what Spencer Dinwiddie is doing is that he's actually using the Ethereum blockchain. And the Ethereum blockchain is different than the Bitcoin blockchain because you can actually do something called smart contracts. And because Ethereum has something called state, which means that it remembers things. And so what we're seeing is that Spencer using Ethereum to actually say, okay, if these particular criteria are met, investors will benefit from it. And so it's the first time that we're seeing the actual benefit of someone's spectacular career or their professional career or things that they're able to do.
Yes or no, should everybody own a little Bitcoin?
Well, I always tell my father-in-law, and I tell my parents, and I tell my family, it's probably a good idea if you are actually looking to have some insurance against global calamity, that you should have a little bit of yes.
David Nage, Principal of Strategic Relations at Arca. Great to see you. Thank you so much.